All right, everyone, let's get started. So, wow, not that many people here today. We've got 12 people on YouTube. I guess there's the career thing. Maybe people are at that thing. All right, well, props to all of you for not ditching this class for the career fair. Okay, so last time we were talking about decoding algorithms, and we, I think, got through beam search or up till this point, and left off with the sampling-based methods. So today we're going to cover the remaining decoding algorithms from last time, and then we're going to talk about tokenization, which is fundamental thing that you need to do before training any sort of language model or NLP model. And so far in this class, I've been ignoring it, but today we're going to get into the weeds of tokenization. So I had some stuff to talk about like logistically, but they're on the other slides, so we'll just do that in the middle of the class. So let's start off with a review of all of these decoding algorithms that we covered last time. So the simplest one was the greedy search, right? Where at every time step when we're generating a word, we just pick the word that has the highest probability out of all of the words in our vocabulary. So this means the highest conditional probability, right? In this case, we were looking at a sequence-to-sequence model. So if we were generating the very first word here, we would look at the conditional probability of some token conditioned on the start token in the decoding side, as well as the entire input sentence that the encoder processed, right? And then we do this step by step. At each step, we produce one word. This word is fed in as input to the next time step. Then we produce another word, and we just repeat this process. So the problem with greedy decoding was that once you make a prediction of a word using the highest probability word at a particular time step, you're committed to that prediction forever, right? So even if you made a wrong decision, maybe for some reason the model thought that something that doesn't make sense was the most probable word at some time step, you have no way of going back and revising this. And so beam search kind of accounts for this in some way by allowing you to consider multiple different decodings at the same time, right? And so maybe it's the case that early on in the decoding, if I've done, say, 3 time steps, I might think that, this sequence of 3 words looks more probable than this other sequence. But after I decode 10 time steps, maybe that flips, and maybe the one that was initially lower probability is now higher probability. So that's something that I can kind of account for in beam search by having many different hypotheses that I'm considering at every time step. It's something that I can't take into account with greedy search because I'm always locked into a particular decision that I made in the past. So we went over this, right? Here in this example, I had a beam size of 2. So at every single time step, I'm going to expand out the 2 paths that I had from the previous time step, the 2 different decodings. So in this case, I had the poor and a poor as whatever I've produced in the past. And for each of these, I'm going to decode the next word. And then I get, a probability distribution from each path. I'm going to take the top 2 continuations that are most probable, not just the top 1 like we would do in greedy search. So in this particular time step, both of those highest probability continuations stemmed from this top path, the poor are or the poor don't. So now we no longer consider this bottom path starting with at all, right? It's been effectively pruned off, and we are only considering things that start with the poor at this point. And so now here you can see that the purple color indicates that these are the highest probability of all of these continuations. The poor are not, the poor don't have. These are the continuations that I've selected. I'm going to expand those, do some pruning, pick 2 more, and continue this process. a couple questions, which I don't think we got to address in this the previous class. First, does beam search always produce the best translation? Meaning, does it always find the highest probable, the translation or the output with the most probability? Okay, say by n you mean the beam size? Okay, say our beam size is set to 10. Then no, right? So this is still a search algorithm, right? We are not enumerating all possible outputs. We decided that was infeasible. So no, beam search is not guaranteed to find the most probable output sequence. In this example, we were talking about translation, but you can use beam search for any sort of sequence-to-sequence task or any decoding task, right? You can use it for summarization, translation, dialogue, blah, blah, blah. All of these are possible applications for any decoding algorithm. So when does beam search terminate? I think we briefly talked about this last class, but someone want to tell me? So when, in particular, all of the different paths that I have, all of my hypotheses have reached the end of sequence token. So it's not enough if just one of them ends, right? All two, in that example, both paths needed to have ended before. Or if, yeah, so another thing that you might consider is maybe your language model is not trained properly, and for some reason it's not outputting the end of sequence token ever. And this is quite common. So in this case, you might want to have like a fairly high maximum number of of time steps that you will run beam search for. And if not all of the beams have terminated after that point, you'll just cut it off. It's probable that whatever you were decoding didn't really work out if it ever gets to that point. Sometimes these things get stuck in a loop where they keep repeating what they've previously generated, and if that happens, you're never going to get an end of sequence token. There are some pretty cool papers showing exactly how much probability these models place on non-terminating sequences, and it can be quite high, which is one of the failure modes. So yeah. Another question, kind of a segue into the next topic, is what if we want to maximize the diversity of our outputs rather than finding the most probable sequence? So what kind of task might be a good fit for maximizing diversity of the output? So say I have beam search, maybe I'm considering 10 different hypotheses of what's going to be the generated text at once. In beam search, they tend to all look very similar to each other, these hypotheses. They might differ in a couple words here and there, but syntactically, they will usually all be very similar to each other. But in some cases, we might not want this. So are there particular applications you can think of where we might want to optimize for diversity? Yeah. Yeah, so dialogue systems, right? If I ask you if I ask a chatbot, how's your day going? I mean, I don't know why I would ask a chatbot this, but let's say I did. Of course, there's a number of different responses to these, and they can all be very different, right? So if all of your hypotheses in beam search are just variants of, doing well, how about you, then you might not have a very compelling dialogue agent, right? So that is kind of the motivation of using sampling-based approaches which address this problem. So before we get to that, just wanted to make some connections between greedy search and beam search. So a beam search with a beam width of 1, so k equals 1, the number of hypotheses you're considering is 1, is equivalent to greedy search, right? Because at this point, you're only choosing the most probable word at every time step. You don't have any room for multiple hypotheses with beam search of 1. And these are some of the failure cases that are commonly associated with greedy decoding. You can get ungrammatical, unnatural, nonsensical, incorrect text. This seems to just not be a good way of decoding from language models that have been that haven't been trained on huge amounts of data or with huge model sizes. So this kind of changes when you have a much bigger model. It seems like greedy search works better in those cases, but we still prefer the sampling-based approaches. Okay, so of course, if you're doing beam search, there's a trade-off. Like you can, as you said, if your beam width is really, really large, then it becomes equivalent to perhaps enumerating a large portion of the search space, which is not feasible. It's also very computationally expensive to keep around a ton of beams. So that's why in practice you're using a beam width of 5 to 10. But obviously these things depend on the particular model you're using and the task. There are some tasks where using really, really big values of k it actually is effective, but not text generation tasks in general. Okay, so let's see the effect of some of these decisions, increasing the beam width on diversity and other kinds of properties of the text. So this is a chatbot. This human says, I mostly eat a fresh and raw diet, so I save on groceries. And you have some dialogue chatbot model. These are the outputs that you get when you vary the beam width. So with beam size 1, I love to eat healthy and eat healthy. So this is an example of repetition with greedy decoding. That is a good thing to have with beam size of 2. Not a great response. I am a nurse, so I do not eat raw food. I am a nurse, so I'm a nurse. Do you have any hobbies? I guess not at all interested in this, this input. And then you can see that it kind of collapses to a single response after this. What do you do for a living? And you see this very commonly when you're looking at these kinds of dialogue or other tasks that prioritize diversity, is that as you increase the beam width, you're presumably getting higher probability completions, and these are generally very generic responses that could be applicable to many different inputs. So one popular case was just the phrase, I don't know. It's a good response for almost everything, and these models would just produce that for a lot of different situations. It might make sense in the context, but it's not very useful. You probably don't want your chatbot producing these things. I mean, you do, but not at that frequency. So to fix this kind of these failure cases, we can move on to sampling-based approaches. So the easiest of these, I mean, they're all pretty straightforward, but the easiest thing you could think of doing is just, instead of picking the most probable word at every time step, as you would do in greedy decoding, or like multiple high probability words, and obviously dealing with the different hypotheses that you have as you would do in beam search. In a pure sampling-based approach, you just take a random sample where you're sampling from the distribution that the model produces at a particular time step. So you sample the highest probability word with whatever probability that is, but you have a lot of probability mass on the rest of the vocabulary, so you can pick different things. You have very high variance in what you're producing. So what are some issues with this setup, just sampling from the full distribution? Yeah, exactly. There's a chance that whatever word you sample, even if it had like 0.00001 probability, there's still some chance that you could pick it and it's completely inappropriate in the context. And not only that, but even if some individual word that's inappropriate has such a low probability, note that if your vocabulary is large, if it's like tens or hundreds of thousands of words, the cumulative probability assigned to the tail of the distribution becomes quite high with some of these models if they're not properly calibrated. So you might end up taking a lot of samples from the tail of the distribution and getting nonsensical text. So again, with the very large models, this doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. Even sampling from the full distribution yields fairly reasonable outputs most of the time. But there have been some tricks proposed to get rid of this issue of sampling things from the tail of the distribution. So the simplest is called TopK Sampling. On this slide, it's called TopN Sampling because we use K for beam search, so just to avoid confusion. But the overall approach is straightforward. I'll take the distribution and I'll just chop off the words that are outside the top N most probable words. So usually you might set it at something like 40. So at every single time step, I'll take that distribution and I will look at the words that are in the top 40 most probable words, and I'll sample from this. So here I avoid the problem of sampling, from words that are very, very improbable. And this seems to be a fairly good balance between getting something that makes sense in the context, but also is not like super irrelevant. And you also maximize diversity kind of in this way. Like you're able to generate a bunch of different diverse things that are hopefully meaningful within the context. So what happens if I increase the number of words that I consider at, I guess the slide says it, so I won't ask you, right? But if I increase this from 40 to say 10,000, now I'm considering a whole bunch of other words, and some of those words may be very improbable, right? So in this case, I probably will get closer to the output of full sampling. Did you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering in paraphrase or dialogue generation sort of stuff, what is the way that we determine when output is good? So in other tasks, you might have an actual output that you're trying to compare against. But since this task is inherently saying that we want diversity without human annotators to kind of look at the results and be able to evaluate.
Yeah, so the question is, if you have a task, say dialogue or paraphrase generation, where diversity is kind of preferable in the outputs, how exactly do you evaluate? Because you want both the output to be faithful to the task, right? In paraphrase, your output should be, obviously, have roughly the same semantics as the input, but you also want to maximize diversity. So there are some ways you can do this. You can have different metrics. So for example, in paraphrase generation, you could have a metric that strictly measures the semantic similarity between the output and the input. And then you can have another metric that measures diversity, perhaps through like word overlap or syntactic similarity or something like that. And then you can aggregate these metrics together to have a combined metric of diversity and whatever, semantic relatedness or something like that. So this is generally, if you want to use an automatic way of evaluation, this is what you would do. Of course, you might want to involve human annotation as well to measure things like semantic similarity. All right, other questions? I see none on YouTube. Okay, so again, here as a connection to the greedy search, if I set the top N value to 1, I've now fallen back to greedy search, right? I only have one choice at every time step. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask, like, these are the evaluation metrics. So is there any way where we can directly incorporate the output or feedback to the loss function?
Yeah, so the question is, perhaps I have some metric of diversity. Is there some way I can use that metric to guide the model to perhaps produce more diverse outputs? Yeah, there's a lot of work on using reinforcement learning techniques for this kind of thing. So you have some model, it's producing some outputs. You're able to score the outputs using whatever metric you have. So here, the model produces an entire sequence, and only after you do your sampling or your greedy decoding or whatever, do you get a full output. And only then do you put it into one of these evaluation metrics like word overlap or something like that, right? And once you have the score for the entire decoded sequence, the challenge becomes you only have one possible output from this model, right? But if I'm sampling, I could have produced, hundreds of thousands of different outputs. I only have the score for this one output. So reinforcement learning is useful here, especially since your output is a sequence of decisions too, right? At every time step, you make a decision on what word to produce. So it's actually quite complicated. In practice, it doesn't work too well, but many people have tried. You can look in dialogue. People have tried a lot. Also for machine translation with the blue score as a reward. Yeah.
So for TopK sampling, it's not random among the top 40, right? It's still by like original probabilities, or is it uniformly random?
No, it's by the probabilities still.
Okay, so you just truncate the
Yeah, you're just truncating the distribution. Okay, so there's a variant of this top n sampling, which kind of makes more sense intuitively. And so one of the issues here is, how do you choose that n, right? If I just choose 40 for all time steps, there might be an issue where at some time steps, only 3 words are very probable and the rest are all very improbable, but I'm still including them. And so there's a variant called TopK sampling or Nucleus Sampling, which dynamically varies the n depending on the shape of the distribution. So in particular, it will pick an n such that you account for, say, 95% of the probability mass within that n, and you're cutting off the tail, which is 5%. So in some time steps, this might only be like 5 words. In other time steps, this might be 100 words, depending on how confident the model is and so how many choices, equally plausible choices it has at some time step. So the difference between top n and TopK sampling is that for TopK sampling, you choose a probability threshold. Like, I want to choose the n such that I've accounted for 95% of the probability mass. In top n sampling, you don't worry about the probability, you just choose a fixed number at every time step. So there have been many papers that evaluate both of these methods against each other. You can imagine that they're fairly similar, but I think these days most people prefer to use the TopK sampling, which is also called Nucleus sampling, with, of course, adjusting the value of p has similar trade-offs as adjusting the value of n. You can tune it to optimize diversity or make it more generic depending on your choice of p. Oh, so the question is, in top n or TopK sampling, are we still making this tree-like structure as in beam search, meaning that we're considering all these possible paths? No, we're making a single discrete decision at every time step based on whatever word we sampled. So in that way, it's more like greedy search, except the way in which we choose the word at every time step is different. It's just a sample. So commonly with sampling-based approaches, you can, at test time, potentially generate numerous samples from the same input and then have some separate stage that ranks them to produce the best possible output. So with the sampling-based approaches, your outputs are going to be much different from each other, hopefully. So you have more diversity than in beam search. So it basically, the beam search seemed to find that what you do for a living is a very high probable completion of this input here. So as you increase the beam width, you're likely to find higher and higher probability completions, right? Because you're exploring more of the search space. So as you find higher and higher probability completions, you might find these more generic ones which are higher probability and under, yeah. All right, so I wanted to, oh, do you have a question? Yeah. So in nucleus sampling, let's say I just want to produce a single output. In greedy search, at every time step, I pick the most probable word, and that's how I produce the sequence until I produce an end of sequence token. In nucleus sampling, at every time step, I am sampling from this truncated distribution, right? So there's a random process in which I'm choosing what word is produced next. I take a sample from this distribution of, let's say I have 100 candidate words. I'm choosing each of them with some probability. So it's not a deterministic method. The sampling-based approaches are randomly picking one of the most probable words at every time step. But I'm still making this discrete decision to choose one word out of this set. So that's the difference. Okay, so let's look at some examples. This is an example from the Nucleus Sampling paper that kind of shows the differences between all of these methods. I don't know if you can read this, but basically the input is an unprecedented number of mostly young whales have become stranded on the West Australian coast since 2008. And this is what you get if you feed this into a language model and you just decode text from it. With beam search, a beam size here, B, K, whatever, equal to 16. The number of stranded whales has increased by more than 50% in the past year, with the number of stranded whales on the West Australian coast increasing by more than 50% in the past year. The number of blah, 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 it's just repeating whatever it said before. The blue highlighted text just says that this has been repeated. So you can see that this is not desirable at all. And this is what happens when you do pure sampling. So you're not truncating the distribution, you're just sampling blindly from the full distribution. The Australian Food Safety Authority has warned Australia's beaches may be revitalized this year because healthy seabirds and seals have been on the move. This has nothing really to do with the, it has some common themes, right? Australia is a theme. Beach and coast maybe are similar, but in other aspects it's irrelevant. So the red text here is marking things that's possibly irrelevant to the context. Now it starts talking about airports and airplanes and bats and so on. So this is one of the issues if you're sampling from the full distribution and you pick something that has low probability at some point, right? You're going to stray away from the topic that you wanted to cover. So here's TopK sampling with different values of K. So the first one, K equals 640. This is kind of similar to the full sampling approach. Starts talking about pumping station number 3 and has some URLs. Still, it's talking about whales, but it's not relevant, right? It also repeats this killer whale catastrophe thing twice. Wow, I didn't know orcas could be struck by lightning. Okay, I mean, this is also generated text, so maybe that's not possible. So here's a different configuration of TopK sampling with K set to 40. This T here refers to the temperature, which is a hyperparameter you can tune in the softmax. We won't cover it. It's basically a scaling factor that affects the shape of the distribution. So you can see the first sentence is not, it's bad, but it's not too bad. It's talking about the whale's fate. There's no specific whale referred to in the prompt, but at least it's talking about a whale found off a coast. But then it starts repeating itself and it says the whale died after being sucked into the ocean, which is interesting. And this is nucleus sampling. So of course, this is an output that the authors of the paper have picked that their algorithm works best on and all these other ones fail at, but in general, they do some evaluations to show that this is generally true overall. So this one is talking about how other whales, like baby whales, are being caught and blah, blah, blah. So although it also has issues, especially as you generate longer and longer outputs, all of these algorithms will start to degrade in quality. So we still don't have a solution for this, but working on it, yeah.
You know, in terms of the sampling models, so if it's random, then would the output change every single time you run the model?
Yeah, so the question is, if you're using a sampling-based strategy, does the output change every time you decode from the model? The answer is yes. So this is just one random sample from this prompt, but if I run nucleus sampling 5 times, I'm gonna get 5 different outputs.
So you said that in case of pure sampling as well, we mostly generate grammatically correct sentences, although the content might obviously be irrelevant.
Yeah.
How is that even possible? Because we are practically disregarding all the probabilities which we have generated from the language model, right? So even then also it should be grammatically correct sentences should not form in most cases.
What do you mean? So all of these, so the question is basically how, when we sample from the full distribution, are we even forming grammatically correct sentences? I mean, all of this depends on the shape of the distribution that the model is producing at every time step, right? In many cases, the model assigns like 99.999% probability on the most probable word that follows. In some cases, only one word makes sense, right? If I see, and I took a flight to San, right? There's going to be only a very small number of things that could follow this, right? Any city that, so the distributions are not as flat as you might be imagining, especially in cases where you have to produce a function word, like, a preposition or something. There are only going to be words that are of the class that you want to produce that have any meaningful probability. So yeah, if you're interested, you can do an exercise where you go to Hugging Face, you take a model like GPT-2, put some random text into it, and look at the distribution that you get out, and you'll see this for yourself. That, yeah. Okay, yes.
If we use bigram or trigram prediction, so would it help in any way to generate a better coherent sentence?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, why are we just producing one word at a time? What if we augment our vocabulary with bigrams or trigrams? Yeah, this is active research, actually. Marjana is working on this, algorithms like this as we speak. So it hasn't been well studied. As we'll see later in this class, people are going in the opposite direction. So why even generate a word? Why not produce a character or a byte instead? So yeah, very interesting. No clear winner just yet. There's a question here, how to choose between top N and top P. In general, I would recommend using TopK Sampling. You can read the paper that's mentioned here, the curious case of neural text generation, for some systematic comparisons between the two. Okay, so in summary, we've covered greedy decoding, beam search, and sampling-based approaches. Beam search versus sampling-based approaches, it kind of depends on the task. If you want very, very high faithfulness and you don't want diversity, so something like machine translation is a case where everyone uses beam search because you don't want any sort of randomness, really. You want to be as faithful to the input as possible. Versus in dialogue systems or story generation, no one uses beam search for these tasks because you want more diversity, you want less generic outputs, and so on. All right, so in the remaining time, let's move on to the topic for today, which is tokenization. So before we start, some stuff from last time. Someone asked in the anonymous forum about some practical tips on how to fine-tune these big pre-trained models that we've been talking about. So one of the TAs, too, is an expert on this stuff. He'll post something on Piazza with tips for fine-tuning BERT and T5 and so on. There are lots of papers. People have done a lot of different experiments on this to determine, how many iterations should I fine-tune this model for given this data set size, and so on. So that should be useful for your projects and homeworks. So regarding the midterm, we'll release it November 9th and give you 2 full days to complete it. Again, this will be released online. You can use the internet or whatever. It's probably not going to help. And you will submit it on Gradescope. So yeah, we'll cancel class for whatever day that is, so you can just work on the midterm. The class before this, we will do a midterm review. So I'll go over all of the quiz questions. I'll be releasing some practice midterms, the midterms from previous years. So you can look at those, try and solve them. I'll release the solutions later so you can see how well you did. And yeah, we'll go over all the problems during the class immediately before this, this midterm. All right. Any, yeah.
Approximate like time to attempt the intervention.
You'll have 48 hours to complete it.
Okay, so is it timed or not? So,
No, you can, you can take 1 hour, you can take all 48 hours, it's up to you. It should not take 48 hours to do it. All right, so let's start with tokenization. So this is really a question of how do you represent your input text. So far, we've just been talking about words, right? When I have this text, students open their books, I have an embedding for every word in this sentence. Those embeddings come from some larger embedding matrix which holds these vectors for all of the word types, the unique word types in my vocabulary, right? So students has its own vector, opened has its own vector, and so on. So this is called word level tokenization, and it has its pros and cons. But this is basically what we've been doing, right? Maybe students maps to word ID 11 in my vocabulary, opened is word 298, right? We convert the text into these indices, which we can then use to look up the corresponding word embedding and then train our models. So this should all be clear, but one question is how do we even get to this point where we've gone from this input text into these word tokenization, the word tokenized input. So of course I need a way of detecting the word boundaries. In the first homework, we had you use white space as a tokenizer. And many of you posted on Piazza about how this is terrible, like it's ignoring punctuation, it's doing all these other bad things, what do I do with new line characters, blah, blah, blah. So of course you already ran across some of the issues with simple white space tokenization. Here's an example sentence where it really demonstrates some of the complexities of this task. So you can imagine, maybe I'll split on white space and punctuation, and this should get me pretty far. This sentence, Mr. O'Neill thinks that the boys' stories about San Francisco aren't amusing. So in general, if we have something like aren't, this contraction, I would like to split this into R and N apostrophe T, right? That N apostrophe T will be used in, for example, don't and shouldn't and other types of things. But what do I do with O'Neill? Do I really want to split on this apostrophe and have an O and then apostrophe Neil? Probably not, right? Even more non-trivial is something like San Francisco, right? There's a space between these words, but do I really want to treat them as two separate words or just one token? So word tokenizers that give you these word boundaries generally have a bunch of rules written to handle all of these special cases. One popular one is released by Spacey. They have a bunch of models on their website, many tokenizers that trade off speed versus accuracy and so on. So you can check it out at spacey.io. They also have a lot of other very useful tools for low-level pre-processing that could be useful for your projects. So that's all fine. Maybe we have a tokenizer and we can split on words, but word tokenization has some flaws. One of the most important ones is that it's very unclear how to handle unknown words. So even if I have all of the internet as my training data, I'm still going to encounter unknown words, presumably at test time. What is a scenario in which this might occur? Yeah, so what if a new word is created, right? Or someone invents a new name like Elon Musk's kid, right? That's probably never been seen before. How am I going to put that into my language model, right? So what happens really when we want to apply this at test time and we see an unknown word? If we do nothing, then our models are going to break, right? We're going to encounter this word that we've never seen before at training time. We don't have an embedding associated with this word, right? It wasn't observed in training time. And so what are we going to do? One approach is very simple, is just if I see such a word, I'll just ignore it. So I'll treat it as if it doesn't even exist. What are some issues with that? Why might I not want to do that? Yeah, exactly. So that could mess with the grammar of the sentence, right? Maybe it's easy to recover if there was only one missing word, but what happens if there are 3 words in a row that you've never seen before, right? Then it becomes hard to even distinguish what could have gone in that drop text. So yeah, that's definitely a major issue. So the common way before we moved to some of these more advanced tokenizations to handle this was during training, I'm going to take a bunch of rare words that don't occur very much in the training data, and I'll replace all of them with a special unknown word type, so this Enc token. So if I observed a word at training time that only appeared once in my training data, maybe I would replace this with the Enc token, and I would do the same for all other rare words in the training data set. So now my training data set, I observe this Enc word, right? And at test time, if I see something that's not in my training data, I can just replace it with this Enc token. My language model can learn to predict this Enc token. And you know, it's not perfect, but it's a kind of hack to get around this. So one question could be, why can't I just add this Enc token into my vocabulary? Why do I actually have to replace training data words with the Enc token before actually training my model? Why do I need to do this? Yes. Yeah, exactly. So if I just blindly add this Enc token, maybe it gets its own embedding, but I don't actually replace any words in my training data set with the Enc token, that Enc embedding receives no training at all, right? The model will never learn to predict the Enc token either, so it will not be helpful at all. So yeah, that's why you want the model to be able to see instances of every word in the training data so it learns how to handle them. And Enc is just a special type of word. So for many years, people were doing this for their pre-processing methods. And then, you know, we were getting a lot of examples like this where there would be multiple words that you would have to replace with Enc. So here, I don't know Welsh, but these 2 words were getting replaced by Enc. It becomes very hard to tell what is even being referred to here. And you're losing a lot of important information, right? You're missing the actual name of this thing, this chapel. So this is a problem. You're always going to be losing information when you replace stuff with Enc tokens. And this is why competing tokenizations were developed to address this issue. So word level tokenization, setting aside the unknown word issue, it also has other limitations. So even in our example, students opened their books, right? The word opened has a different embedding than open or opens or opening, even though these all share the same root word open, right? And you know, what happens if one form of open, maybe the past tense form opened, doesn't occur as many times as open? I'm not sharing information between all of these occurrences. So maybe one of these forms is undertrained somehow. It depends on your data set, right? The problem is I have separate embeddings for all of these different forms of the same word. So I really need to see a lot of training data for every form in order to properly be able to model them. Okay, so I just explained why this is problematic when training over smaller data sets. I might not observe enough instances of all of these. Yeah. So the question is, don't I need to have different embeddings in order to actually produce these different forms of the word? Like if I had only one embedding for all of these different forms, then how do I even distinguish which one to produce? We'll see how we deal with that when we get to subword embeddings. But the spoiler is we'll have maybe one subword with open, and then we have another subword with the suffix ed or ing, and then when combined, the model will essentially predict the word opened with 2 time steps, open and then ed. All right. So an alternative to this, which doesn't have any unknown issues, is character level tokenization. So why do I even need to split this into a sequence of words? when I know that I can just split everything into characters. I only have, in English, 26 letters, some digits, some special characters, and I can, encode everything. I can encode all of these names that I've never seen before in my training data set because they're just sequences of letters that I have seen. So, one of the major issues with this is that every input now gets broken into a much longer sequence than it would with word level tokenization, right? So if you look at our running example, students open their books. This is only 4 words, but it's like, 20 or something characters long. So why might I care about the sequence length when I'm making these tokenization decisions?
You're doing the search, for example, you need like a much bigger size in order to predict the words.
So that's interesting because here, if I have a character level vocabulary, the vocabulary is going to be much smaller than a word level vocabulary, right? I might have, say, 50 characters in my vocabulary. So presumably I could exhaustively search even over a very small vocabulary. The decoding is not, I mean, it is an issue, but not for the reason you mentioned. Yeah, so this is one issue is now that I've made the sequence much longer, I now have to deal with these long-range dependencies between, what students and opened, they used to be right next to each other in this, in the word level tokenization. But now just getting from the D in open to students requires going back several time steps, right? So I might have to deal with longer dependencies. We showed in an RNN how these models can struggle practically to actually encode these long-term dependencies. So that's definitely a problem. There's another issue. Yeah, so this is the main issue with these kinds of encodings is that if I go from 4 token sequence to 25 token sequence, I now have to use a lot more compute in order to model this sequence, right? So it's kind of tricky to think of this, right? Because on one hand, I've reduced the number of parameters in my model because I only have, say, 50 character embeddings instead of 30 or 100,000 word embeddings. So definitely fewer parameters here. And my softmax output layer is smaller too, right? I only have 50 possible outputs instead of tens of thousands. On the other hand, I have more time steps, right? And if you think about the transformer, the self-attention computation, this is actually quadratic. It scales quadratically, the time complexity with the sequence length. So why is that? Why is it quadratic? Exactly. So remember in the query key dot product, right? At every time step, I'm taking the query vector of a particular word and comparing it to all of the other words in the sequence. And I'm doing this for every single word in the sequence. So I get this n squared complexity. So as the sequences get longer and longer, the transformer becomes less and less and less efficient. And so even though I save some compute by making my vocabulary smaller, this doesn't actually matter if I have a very, very deep transformer, right? Where most of my parameters might be in the query key value projections and the feed forward layer and not actually in the vocabulary. So we'll look at some examples of this from a paper later on, which models the kind of savings that you get from these decisions. Yeah.
So, like in transformer, then don't you benefit from the parallelization of the entire process? Like even if the computer is saving, so transformers have an inherent property that they are parallelizable. So
yeah, so you can surely parallelize the computations. And this does, for smaller models, make the effect of the n squared not so bad. But still, with very long sequences, it's going to pop up. And also, in practice, it's really not the vocabulary size that's the issue that you get savings from, but the size of the feed forward layer. So that dominates the computation compared to the self-attention. And it really just makes it such that the more time steps that you have, that you're producing something at test time, the more times you have to go through that huge stack of feed-forward layers. And this is the biggest slowdown, practically. I mean, at some sequence length, the quadratic complexity might start to dominate the computation of the feed-forward layer, but for all reasonable sizes, that's not the case. But yeah, these are things that kind of depend on the model size and the sequence length as well. Anyway, so it's hard to just blindly shift the character tokenization because of all the reasons you all have mentioned. And so this motivates this. Yeah, go ahead. So the question is, if we use a character level encoding, and I guess you're talking about a test time when we're generating from this model, does the model prefer to generate smaller words? Why would that be the case? I don't think that's true. I mean, so what happens with these character and even the subword type models is that it's very difficult to predict the first character or the first subword that makes up a larger word. But then once you've like committed to a particular partial, like the first character of the word, it becomes very easy to predict the remaining characters, right? If I, for example, let's see here. What's a good example? Okay, so let's say I'm at this word here, ligwi. I know. And I have predicted 2 L's. These are the hardest part by far, right? If I've already predicted these 2 L's, like how many possible things start with 2 L's? It's probably like not very many, right? And in this context, the probability of producing I given this is going to be extremely high. The probability of producing G given LLI is going to be incredibly high, and so on. So actually making these intra-word decisions is fairly easy. It's just deciding what character should start a new word is hard because that really involves the long-range dependencies, right? Where you have to actually understand the meaning of the context outside of the last word to make this prediction. So I don't know if that answered your question, but let's get to the subword tokenization. So this paper was assigned as reading, this Senrick et al. ACL paper. It's a kind of, it aims to strike a balance between character and word level tokenization. So this initially was developed for machine translation, but has now been used in almost everything that we've talked about up till now. So BERT uses subword tokenization, T5, Roberta, GPT, all of these things are using subword level tokenization. So it's important to understand how this works. And all of these subword level tokenization algorithms, there's a couple of different variants, but they're all very similar to each other. And I'm going to go over one algorithm called byte pair encoding, which all of the other ones are just minor variations of. So basically what you do in byte pair encoding is you first, oh, did I get rid of this? Whoops, sorry. So the very first step in byte pair encoding, which I seem to have deleted off these slides, is you have to do a pre-tokenization step where you apply a word tokenizer to split your input into words. So in this case, I had an input text stream that consisted of only 5 different words: hug, pug, pun, bun, and hugs. This example is from Hugging Face, so they use a lot of hug type words, I guess. Yeah, even I'll fix the slide later, but the first step here is to run word tokenization. So I get some string, some input string my data set is encoded in. I apply something like space E or white space tokenization or something to split this up into words. And then I will just count up the frequency with which all of these words occur. So in my data set, the word hug occurred 10 times, pun occurred 12 times, hugs occurred 5 times, and so on. I had a pretty boring data set. There were only 5 words in it. And so after I've split the data into words, the next step is I'm just going to look at all the unique characters that occur in those words, right? So in this data set, I have these 7 characters, B, G, H, N, P, S, U. These are going to be my initial vocabulary. So in a subword vocabulary, characters are part of this vocabulary. So I initially start with character level tokenization, and the intuition is that if I observe 2 characters occur together very frequently, I'm going to merge them into a 2-character subword. And then I'm going to just iteratively do this merging so I can get larger and larger subwords based on how frequently they occur with each other. So the subword tokenization, byte pair encoding, you're going to get a different set of subwords for a different training data set. The subwords are determined by the statistics of characters and words in your data set. Okay, so anyway, we have these 5 words. We have the counts, how often they occur, and we have the characters that make up these words. What's the next step? So now I'm going to consider each word as a sequence of characters. So instead of the word hug, this is now 3 characters, H, U, G. And I'm going to look at, for all of the pairs of characters in each word, the adjacent characters, I'm just going to count up how often they occur. So that's this table on the right over here. I see that the word, the pair UG occurs 20 times. So you can see it occurs 10 times in hug, 5 times in pug, and 5 times in hugs, right? So 20 times. And similarly, I can count up the all the other character pairs that occur in this data set, count up their frequency, and rank them by the frequency. So I find that UG is the most frequent character pair in my data set. So the next step is I'm going to merge UG into a single subword. And I'm going to add this new thing, UG, into my vocabulary. So now I have the same 7 characters as before, and I also have this new item to my vocabulary, which is U plus G. So every time UG occurs in my data set, I'm now going to use this new subword token instead of U plus G from before. So once I do this, I'm going to resegment my training data set using the new vocabulary. Now I've added 1 new type into my vocabulary, right? This UG. So when I retokenize the data, notice that the word hug, which used to be H plus U plus G, these 3 characters, is now just H plus this new token UG, this combined character. And now I'm going to count up all the character pairs again. Now, this time, note that my vocabulary is not all characters. It now includes the subwords. So you can see that H plus UG is now considered a pair of items in my vocabulary. But the next most frequent one is UN, which occurs 16 times, right? It occurs in PUN 12 times and BUN 4 times. H plus UG occurs, of course, in hug and in hugs, so it occurs 15 times. Anyway, I'll choose UN. I'll create a new symbol for UN, put it into my vocabulary, resegment the training data set, just keep doing this over and over and over again until I reach a fixed number of merges that I set beforehand. So, I could add 40,000 merge operations or something like this, and I'll get a vocabulary of however many characters I started with plus 40,000. So I've created 40,000 merged characters. So note that H plus UG, like these new subwords can be chosen to be merged. And so after I choose UN and merge it, the next thing I do is merge H plus UG. And now hug, HUG, becomes a new subword in my vocabulary. So eventually, let's say here I stopped after 3 merges. So hug, HUG, is now no longer 3 characters, but just 1 subword. It's actually a complete word, right? And this is how the rest of the data looks. And here's my new vocabulary after 3 merges. So I've added UG, UN, and hug to my vocabulary. So you can imagine doing this on real data. You get a lot of these subwords that are accumulating together more and more characters. And this is just a very simple frequency-based algorithm for adding them together. All right, any questions?
This is a non-deterministic process when you break up words and you could have like different combinations of subwords that form a single word. Like for example, hug could be H4UG or it could be H2G.
Yeah, so when you're, so after you complete this process and you've decided on your vocabulary, there's another algorithm that tries to do this segmentation, right? And you're going to optimize for the smallest number of units that make up a single word, basically. So that's why you're kind of getting the balance between characters, which have too many time steps, too long sequences, and words which have all these other issues. So with the subword tokenization, you're kind of trying to keep your sequences as short as possible while still being able to handle unknown words and all of that. So you can see through this BPE algorithm that if I have an unknown word, I'll always be able to represent it as a sequence of the base characters, provided all the characters are observed in my training data set. Okay, yeah, I mean, this was pretty simple. Yeah, the thing I just said was I can still get unknown words in BPE if I haven't observed a character at test time, right? So one common trick is just to use bytes instead of characters as your base vocabulary. So this way you can encode, any possible character. You can apply BPE on top of a sequence of bytes rather than characters. Of course, you have to do some special operations to probably prevent merging across white space and other rules like that. You can look in the GPT-2 paper for the exact details of how they did this. And it's pretty common to have a subword vocabulary of 32 to 64,000 different characters plus subword types. All right. So after the development of BPE, there have been a couple different variants that you might see if you're just reading papers. Two of the most common ones are word piece, which is exactly the same as BPE, except instead of choosing which subword to merge, which pair of characters / subword to merge, by frequency you choose it by the likelihood as measured by a language model. So you choose a merge which most increases the likelihood of your training data. This involves training a language model and then using it to score the possible merges. There's also sentence piece, which does away with this, which can at least do away with the requirement of pre-tokenizing your data at the word level. So one interesting question maybe I should ask is, why did I need to split my data into words to do this? Why couldn't I have just said, here's a string, let me count up the characters and the character pairs and then pick the most common one to merge? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if I did that, then I might merge with a white space, right? And then I might merge like across multiple words that probably shouldn't be merged together, but just because they occur frequently together, I might create a subword which is actually like multiple words or something like that. So sentence piece is an algorithm that kind of gets away from requiring this pre-tokenization step. It is good for languages that don't necessarily separate their words with spaces. So there are, like Thai or Chinese are like this. But they also mention in the sentence piece algorithm that doing the word level pre-tokenization helps a lot with performance. So this is not a perfect way of dealing with this particular issue. So subwords, they have their own limitations. So for languages like Turkish, where you might form entire sentences potentially, or new words by just adding new parts onto the existing word. It's kind of tricky to use this pre-tokenization to actually get your base vocabulary and your segmented words. It might not make sense. Here's an example from the K9 paper, which is an optional reading, which shows that in Arabic you have this non-concatenative morphology where the consonants are in the root word, and then you're adding vowels and stuff when you're using this word in different contexts. So like he wrote has these consonants, but you've interspersed these vowels in between. So it's not like you can just like kind of glom on character pairs together if you have something like this, where the variants of the word depend on how it's being used. So these are some examples of potential issues with the kind of subword algorithm that we've described. And this kind of thing motivates the byte T5 paper, which was one of the assigned readings, which completely does away with tokenization at all. So instead of viewing your input as a sequence of words or even characters, you can view it as a sequence of bytes. And basically byte T5 retrains the multilingual T5 model, which is very similar to the T5 model we talked about, except it's trained on not just English, but like 100 different languages, but is the same exact objective and so on. So this left side here describes how this MT5 model works. Basically, I take some sentence. I'm not going to try and pronounce whatever this is. And I use sentence piece, so some subword algorithm, to segment this input into multiple subwords. And then I apply my T5 objective, right? So remember in T5, we randomly select some spans of, in this case, subwords to mask out. And then we replace them with these special sentinel tokens as X and Y. And then our targets are just trying to predict the missing spans that I've eliminated, right? So this is what happens in MT5. In byte T5, we replace, so our input is just the bytes corresponding to the UTF-8 encoding of this input sentence. So you can see that my input sequence is a lot longer now because I'm using bytes instead of subwords. But the objective is the same. I'm masking out some of these bytes and I'm trying to predict them. And you can see also in this example that the spans that I'm masking out in this byte T5 model are longer. They're averaging 20 bytes, I think, compared to 3 subwords, or I think 3 subwords in the T5 paper. So yeah, in this approach, you don't need to do anything to your input data, right? You just encode it and then convert it to this sequence of bytes, and then your model is directly trained on this. So what are some advantages of representing your input as a sequence of bytes rather than subwords? I said advantages. So in byte T5, my vocabulary is only 256, bytes, right? So that's pretty interesting because my embedding layer now, I only have 256 types in my vocabulary. And I can use this to represent anything in any language, basically, regardless of the properties of that language. So it gets rid of some of these issues that we mentioned with subwords, where maybe that algorithm BP is not too applicable to different languages, right? Here, the model has to figure out, like, okay, I observed this sequence of bytes. Maybe it corresponds to this language. I've learned all these properties of this language, so I should know how to handle this particular sequence. So the idea is you get rid of a lot of pre-processing, which might be language dependent, right? Like word tokenization depends a lot on what language you're doing. If you're doing, Chinese versus English, it's going to be very different. And you don't have to do that here. So tokenization can be very expensive. If you have a multilingual model like one of these, then you might just want to ignore it altogether. Yeah.
Isn't it similar to character level tokenization?
Yeah, but you can actually have a lot of different characters, right? And so it's very similar, but here at least you have fixed vocab of 256 bytes, and you don't have to deal with potentially large number of UTF-8 characters, because there's a lot of those. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know actually. Probably not. I should. Well, maybe someone can look into it and see. Yeah.
So how do you want to visualize the attention alignments when you go down to the like, what does it make sense?
That I don't think anyone has tried to visualize the attention in byte level models. It would be an interesting project, but I doubt they make much sense because like attention makes sense kind of at the word level if you have, you know, in translation the same word mapping to in different languages. But at the byte level, like where should something attend to? It's very unclear. So I would expect not, but yeah, no one has. This is a very new paper actually. So yeah.
Isn't the length of the sequence very large?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that now. But first, I just wanted to reinforce this thing I've been saying, which is if we replace our 64,000 subword type vocabulary with 256 bytes, we dramatically reduce the percentage of our model parameters that are associated with the vocabulary. So in a small T5 model, which has 300 million parameters, 85% of those parameters are in the word embeddings or the softmax layer. You can see that this percentage decreases as the model gets bigger and bigger, meaning deeper and deeper, because more parameters then are allocated to the intermediate transformer blocks. But compare that to byte T5. Even with a small model, you have only 0.3% of your parameters in the word embeddings and softmax layer, because you only have 256 bytes. So one of the arguments of this paper, another advantage of the byte encoding, is that since you don't have to waste so many parameters on your vocabulary, you can put more parameters into the rest of your model. So you can actually train it with the same parameter budget, a much deeper and wider network. So this is one of the benefits. Another benefit is that if you have tasks that have noisy data, this byte kind of encoding, tokenization, is going to be much more robust to like misspellings or random noise injected than the subword level model. And to test this in the byte T5 paper, they add different types of noise to various data sets and observe the model performance as you add more noise. So some of the noise they add is like dropping characters, repeating characters. Ant speak is pretty interesting. So they capitalize all characters and then add spaces between each character. You can see that this is really bad for the normal T5 model. It affects accuracy by like 34% if you do this at just a test time. The byte T5 model is not like completely robust to this, right? It still degrades considerably, but not as much. So you can see that in general, across all of these different noise functions, byte level encoding is more robust to noise. This is good, for example, if you want to apply your model to tweets or something like that, right? You probably will benefit from using this over a subword model. So going back to your question, how do we deal with this increased sequence length? So in byte T5, they just ignore this problem completely, and they say that, well, T5 was trained with 1,024 subwords as the sequence length. In byte T5, I'm just going to train on 1,024 bytes as my max sequence length. So this means that, in effect, their sequences that they're pre-training on are much shorter, right? But for all the tasks that they evaluate on, it seems like it doesn't really matter. But I agree that this is a big issue with the byte level models that this paper doesn't try and handle at all, but we'll see later in the semester some modifications on the transformer that actually make it feasible to handle longer sequences. So one result in this paper that shows the negative side of this byte levels modeling is if you're using byte T5 to generate text, it's going to be up to 7 times slower. And this figure was when they're trying to generate a sentence. As you try and generate like a paragraph or something, it'll be way more slow. So just due to the increased sequence length, your test time usage is going to be much slower because you have way more time steps at which you're generating. Then at some point you have the quadratic complexity start to kick in when you have a lot of time steps. All right, so we're out of time, but I guess I will just quickly finish with the other cool thing that has recently come up, which is, all right, so we have all these deterministic tokenization schemes like words or subwords or bytes or so on. How do we decide which one is best? Maybe we don't decide at all and we just try a bunch of them and let the model learn which one is best. So this char-former paper is a pretty interesting step in that direction. Basically, it just segments the text into characters, blocks of 2 characters, blocks of 3 characters, blocks of 4 characters, and then it considers all of these as different segmentations. And then to get the representation of 1 character, we basically now have that character is encoding. It's also part of these 3 different blocks. And we'll just have a softmax over all of these 4 representations and allow the model to decide for any particular character which block should it take its representation from. So that at a high level is the intuition here. I'm sure we'll see more things in this vein in the future, so you should stay tuned for that. But pretty cool way of kind of integrating a bunch of the things that we've talked about into a single model. All right, so that's it. See you next week.